The ledger was open on the kitchen table when Tobias Townsend walked through the door, and Celia Beckett did not look up. That was the first thing that told him something was wrong. Celia always looked up. She was the kind of woman who heard hoofbeats from 3 fields away and had coffee poured before a man had even tied his horse to the post. But tonight the lamplight was burning low and orange over her bent head, and her fingers were moving across a column of numbers with the focused, deliberate calm of someone who had already made a decision and was simply working out the finer details. Tobias stopped in the doorway. Dust from the field still clung to his coat, to the creases beside his eyes, to the back of his hands where he had wiped sweat away over and over through the long, catastrophic afternoon. He looked at his wife, at the careful way she was holding the pen, at the particular set of her shoulders, and something cold moved through him that had nothing to do with the October night air coming off the Kansas plains. "Supper is on the stove," she said without lifting her eyes. "Rabbit stew. Biscuits are wrapped in the cloth." "Celia," she finally looked up, and the expression on her face destroyed him. It was not accusation. It was not anger. It was something worse than both those things combined. Something quiet and steady and heartbreakingly compassionate. The expression of a woman who had known a terrible truth and had spent the entire day sitting with it alone so that when her husband came home she could meet him without panic, without recrimination, with nothing but a hand already extended toward a solution. "How bad is it?" she asked softly. The words he had been rehearsing all the way across the back field, across the dry creek bed, across the dead and blackened rows that had once been their entire future. All of those words collapsed in his chest like a barn roof under the first real snow. He had been going to say it was fine. He had been going to say they had lost the north section, but the south section would hold. He had been going to find some angle, some shadow of silver lining, some way to tell her the harvest had failed without saying those words, because those words felt like the end of everything, and Tobias Townsend had never in his 31 years on this earth admitted to failure without his whole body fighting against it like a man caught in a flash flood. But she already knew. The ledger, the numbers, the way she was not panicking. She already knew, and she was already solving it, and the realization of that broke him open in a way the ruined harvest had not. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and for the first time in the 3 years of their marriage, Tobias Townsend put his face in his hands. Let us go back to the beginning of that year, because the disaster that arrived in October had roots that reached all the way into the cold, hopeful soil of March. And understanding how two people could love each other so deeply and still nearly destroy everything requires understanding how they came to be standing in that kitchen on that particular night, each carrying a secret they believed the other could not bear. Tobias Townsend had come to Hays City, Kansas in the spring of 1882 with a mule, a plow, $200 in a leather pouch sewn inside his boot, and a pride so deeply rooted in his character that his own mother had once told him it would either build him an empire or bury him in one. He was the third son of a Virginia tobacco farmer who had lost everything in the war and spent the 2 decades afterward rebuilding with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. And Tobias had inherited that ferocity along with the stubborn jaw and the dark eyes, and the silence that his family had always mistaken for strength, but was, in truth, a kind of armor. He had filed his homestead claim under the Homestead Act, 160 acres of flat Kansas grassland, and he had broken the sod himself, 1 inch at a time, until the blisters on his palms hardened into calluses and the calluses hardened into something that felt like certainty. He planted winter wheat in the fall and spring wheat in the spring, and by the summer of 1882 he had the beginnings of something real. Something his. He had not planned on a wife. Celia Beckett arrived in Hays City on the noon train from St. Louis in June of that same year, which meant she stepped off the platform into a Kansas summer afternoon that felt like standing too close to a forge fire, with her traveling trunk, her carpet bag, and a letter in her pocket from the placement office that had matched her to a position as a schoolteacher for the Hays City Schoolhouse starting in September. She was 24 years old, the daughter of a schoolmaster from Ohio who had died the previous winter, and left her with a good education, a strong will, and no earthly reason to stay in a city that held nothing but frozen grief. She had applied for the placement out of a kind of deliberate recklessness, the decision of a woman who understood that grief left alone becomes a cage, and she had no intention of living in a cage. She had dark auburn hair that she wore twisted up at the back of her neck, because the Kansas heat made anything else impossible, and gray eyes the color of the sky just before a serious storm. And she walked through Hays City that first afternoon with the particular posture of a woman who was aware that she did not belong here yet, but was fully committed to the project of belonging. The town itself was not what the newspapers back east described when they wrote about the frontier in tones of romantic adventure. Hays City in 1882 was raw and functional and occasionally rough, a railroad town with a livestock trade that brought dust and noise, and a rotating population of cowboys passing through on trail drives. The permanent residents were a mixed community of homesteaders, merchants, a few doctors and lawyers who had followed the railroad west, German immigrants who had taken to the Kansas soil, with a practicality that the native-born Americans often envied, and a scattering of freedmen who had come north after the war seeking land of their own under the same Homestead Act, building their own claims with the same sweat and hope as everyone else, and facing a different category of obstacles in doing so. Celia found her lodging at the Whitmore House, a boarding establishment run by a practical widow named Helen Whitmore who rented rooms to respectable single women, and kept a strict policy about male visitors that she enforced with the calm authority of someone who had survived considerable chaos and emerged with her standards intact. On her second morning in Hays City, Celia walked to the general store to purchase chalk and a good penknife and a small notebook, and she walked directly into Tobias Townsend, who was coming out of the same door with a 50-pound sack of seed corn over one shoulder and his attention entirely on the list in his other hand. The collision was not dramatic. He caught her elbow before she fell. The items scattered. They both crouched at the same moment to collect them, and their hands closed around the same notebook at the same time, and when they looked up their faces were approximately 12 inches apart. Tobias had not spoken to a woman of his own approximate age in several months. The isolation of the homestead life was a kind of forbidden territory he had not fully appreciated until this particular moment, when he found himself looking into gray eyes that were currently busy being annoyed at him with a precise and articulate quality that suggested their owner was accustomed to identifying the source of problems and addressing them directly. "I apologize," he said, and meant it, which was the thing that surprised Celia most. She had expected a dismissal or a tip of a hat and a quick retreat. She had not expected a direct apology from a tall, sun-darkened man in a dusty coat who was looking at her with an expression that was partly embarrassed and partly something more complicated. "You should look where you are walking," she said, and then, because she had been raised by a schoolmaster who valued accuracy, she added, "Though I was not looking either, so perhaps we share the fault equally." He helped her to her feet. He told her his name. She told him hers. He held the door of the general store open while she went in to complete her purchases, and then he stood on the wooden sidewalk for a long moment before loading the seed corn into his wagon, looking at nothing in particular, wearing the expression of a man who has just noticed something significant without yet having the words for what it is. The courtship, such as it was, unfolded over the summer months with the methodical, cautious quality that characterized everything Tobias did. He came to town on Saturdays for supplies. Celia came to the store on Saturdays because the week's newspapers arrived from Topeka on the Friday evening train. The probability of encountering each other was therefore mathematically high, and both of them were intelligent enough to recognize that the encounters were not entirely coincidental after the first 2 or 3. He asked her to walk with him along the creek on the 4th of July when the whole town gathered for the celebration, and she said yes without pretending to deliberate about it. They walked for 2 hours while the bonfire burned behind them, and the fiddle music carried on the dry summer air, and they talked about everything except the things that mattered most. He talked about the wheat and the soil, and the particular challenge of farming on the Great Plains, where the weather operated with a total indifference to human plans. She talked about the school, and the children she was already anticipating, and the books she had brought in her trunk that she intended to read through the winter when the light died early, and the world contracted to the size of a single lamplit room. He did not tell her about the loneliness. She did not tell him about the grief that had followed her all the way from Ohio, like a shadow that refused to diminish with distance. Those were the hidden things, the secrets they were not yet ready to share, and it would take the specific disaster of the harvest failure to finally force them into the open. He proposed in August, sitting on the top rail of his fence at the edge of the south field, watching the wheat move in the late evening breeze with the particular satisfied hunger of a man who has built something real and wants to show it to someone. He did not go down on one knee. He was not that kind of man, or rather he had not yet been taught to be, and Celia later said that the way he proposed was exactly right for him, direct and a little awkward and entirely sincere. "I think you should marry me," he said, looking at the wheat rather than at her, which was either cowardice or self-preservation and possibly both. "You think I should," she said. "Yes." "Why?" He turned to look at her then, and the expression on his face was the one she would spend years trying to describe to her sister in letters, the expression of a man who has looked at something true and cannot look away, even though the truth of it is frightening. "Because I cannot think of a single good reason you should not," he said, "and because every day I drive into town I am hoping I will see you, and because winter is coming and this house is very quiet." She looked at him for a long moment. The wheat moved behind him. The sky was going gold and red above the flat horizon. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." They were married in September by the circuit preacher in the Hayes City Methodist Church, with Helen Whitmore and a neighboring homesteader named George Albrecht and his wife serving as witnesses. Celia wore her best dress, blue wool with white trim, and carried a small bunch of prairie wildflowers that she had gathered herself that morning, because she had not wanted to make a fuss, and she had not wanted Tobias to spend money on something that would wilt by afternoon. He thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and he told her so, quietly, in the side door of the church before they went in, and the way she smiled at him was a weapon he did not know he was going to spend the rest of his life trying to deserve. The first year of their marriage was not easy, but it was good. There is a difference between those two things that the frontier teaches early. Easy means smooth and without friction. Good means meaningful and worth the cost, even when the cost is high. They learned each other in the close quarters of the farmhouse through the long Kansas winter, learned each other's habits and silences, and the particular ways their stubborn natures collided and resolved. And they were discovering that the collision and the resolution were both interesting, that the friction between two strong people can generate heat of its own. Celia kept teaching through the spring, driving herself to the schoolhouse in the small wagon while Tobias worked the fields, and she handed her teacher's salary directly into the household account, because they needed every dollar and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Tobias accepted this with a gratitude he was not entirely able to voice, which was a pattern she was learning to read like a second language, the things he did not say being often more informative than the things he did. The second year brought a decent harvest and a small expansion. They planted an additional 40 acres of spring wheat. Celia grew a kitchen garden that produced an abundance of tomatoes and beans and corn. They bought 2 more horses. The house, which had been a single large room with a loft when Celia arrived, acquired a proper second bedroom, and a proper kitchen extension that Tobias built himself over the course of 6 weeks, working from sunup to past sundown with the carpenter in town providing occasional guidance. The night he finished it, Celia made a supper with every dish she knew how to cook and lit every candle in the house, and they sat at the new table in the new kitchen, and Tobias looked around at what they had made together, and something in his face went very still and very soft. "We are building something," he said. "We are," she agreed. He reached across the table and took her hand, which was not a thing he did often, and she looked at his fingers wrapped around hers, at the roughness of his palm against the roughness of her own, and she thought that this was the truest version of love she had ever encountered, not the kind that lived in the poems she had grown up reading, but the kind that lived in shared labor and shared silence, and two people deciding every single morning to keep building. The third year, which was 1884, began with every reason for optimism. The winter had been cold but manageable. The soil was ready. Tobias planted the largest wheat crop he had yet attempted, stretching now across nearly all of his available acreage, pouring not only their savings but a loan of $150 from the Hayes City Bank into seed and equipment. The loan sat in the back of his mind like a stone he was carrying, heavy but manageable as long as everything went according to plan. The plan required the rain to come at the right time, and the heat to stay within reason, and the grasshoppers to go elsewhere. The plan required the kind of cooperation from the natural world that the Great Plains sometimes granted and sometimes withheld, with a randomness that no amount of preparation could fully account for. The summer of 1884 on the Kansas plains was the kind of summer that became a dark marker in the memories of everyone who lived through it. The rain failed in July. The heat came in August with a sustained and remorseless ferocity that cracked the earth and turned the shallow creek beds to ribbons of pale mud, and then to nothing at all. The grasshoppers arrived in the third week of August in the vast clouds that could darken the midday sky and devour a field of standing wheat in hours. And the farmers of Ellis County, Kansas, watched their year's work disappear into that moving darkness with the specific helplessness of people who understood that the land held all the power and they held almost none. Tobias walked his fields in the mornings and evenings of August and September with the expression of a man watching something die and being unable to do anything but witness it. The north field was gone first, the wheat there already stressed by the drought and then simply consumed. The south field held a little longer, the soil there being slightly better and the small irrigation ditch he had dug the previous spring providing some minimum of moisture. But by late September even the south field was conceding defeat, the heads of wheat small and half-formed and barely worth the cost of the thrashing. He did not tell Celia. This is the thing that matters, the pivot around which everything else turned. He did not tell her because he could not find the words that would carry the full weight of what it meant without also carrying the implication that he had failed her, that he had taken her from the relative comfort of a teaching position and a boarding house and brought her into a partnership that was supposed to grow and instead was contracting, and that the loan at the bank now represented not a manageable risk but a genuine crisis. He told himself he was protecting her. He told himself she had enough to worry about, that she had been tired lately, that she did not need to carry this burden alongside him. He told himself he would find a solution first and present it to her already solved, because that was the kind of man he had been taught to be, the man who stands between his family and disaster and does not admit to the disaster until it is already past. What he did not know, because his pride had constructed a particular kind of blindness, was that Celia had been watching the fields alongside him every single morning from the kitchen window, and she had eyes that her schoolmaster father had trained to observe and assess, and she had been doing her own calculations since the middle of August. She knew the north field was gone. She had seen it. She had walked it herself on a Tuesday afternoon in late August when Tobias was in town at the feed store, walking the rows with her hand trailing through the brittle, stunted stalks, and her mind moving with the particular focused clarity that came to her when she was solving a problem she had not yet acknowledged out loud. She had counted the rows. She had estimated the yield per acre based on what she could see. She had come home and opened the ledger and worked the numbers forward from that estimate, and the number at the bottom of the page had told her something serious was coming. She had not told him that she knew, because she understood, with the particular intelligence she had developed for reading him over 3 years, that Tobias Townsend, in the grip of his own pride, was a specific kind of man who needed to come to the truth himself, and that any approach she made before he was ready would cause him to dig in deeper, to insist more forcefully that everything was fine, to spend energy on the performance of competence that should have been spent on solving the problem. So she waited, and while she waited, she thought. She thought about every resource they had access to that was not the harvest. She thought about her sister Margaret Incent. Louis, who had married a man with a dry goods business and who had written in the spring about the business doing well. She thought about the land itself, about the cattle operation that the Albrecht family 3 miles east had been quietly expanding, and about whether there was grazing land on the Townsend claim that could be leased for winter pasture. She thought about the German community in the county who had brought with them from Russia a strain of winter wheat called Turkey Red that their own letters home said was more drought-resistant than the varieties currently planted by the American farmers, and she thought about whether that seed could be obtained for next year's planting even if this year was a complete loss. She wrote letters. She wrote to her sister. She wrote to a seed merchant in Topeka, whose advertisement she had seen in the Hayes City newspaper 3 weeks earlier. She wrote to a cattle broker in Abilene, whose name she had encountered in a conversation at the general store, making inquiries about the possibility of winter grazing leases and what the going rate was. She wrote these letters and sent them to town with the Wednesday Post wagon, and she did all of this while making supper and teaching school and managing the household with a seamless efficiency that she hoped looked like ordinary life rather than what it actually was, which was a woman frantically building a lifeboat before the ship went down. The letters had begun coming back in the first week of October. Her sister Margaret had written with an offer of a personal loan of $60, which was not nothing, and was offered with the kind of uncomplicated generosity that reminded Celia of why she had always loved her sister. The seed merchant in Topeka had confirmed that Turkey Red seed was available through the Mennonite farming community in McPherson County, and had provided a contact name, a man named Heinrich Unruh who could be written to directly. The cattle broker in Abilene had written back with detailed information about winter grazing leases, and the numbers, while not transformative, were good enough to matter. She had arranged all of this and recorded it carefully in the ledger, in a section at the back that she had labeled, in her schoolteacher's clear handwriting, for next year. And then she had sat at the kitchen table on the evening of October the 8th, 1884, and waited for her husband to come home from the fields. He sat across from her with his face in his hands, and she let him sit there for a moment because she understood that the moment of lowering the armor for a man like Tobias was a moment that needed to be honored rather than rushed past. Then she reached across the table and put her hand on his wrist. "Look at me," she said. He raised his head. His eyes were dry, but his face showed everything he had been carrying for 2 months. Every evening he had come home and eaten supper and talked about the small daily things and kept the catastrophe locked behind his teeth. It was all visible now, the exhaustion of the pretense, the weight of the kept secret, the particular shame of a proud man who had promised something and been unable to deliver it. "I know," she said. "I have known since August." He stared at her. "I walked the North Field," she said. "I did the numbers. I know what the bank loan is, I know what the yield would have needed to be, and I know what we are actually looking at. I know all of it. Celia, let me finish." She kept her voice steady, not hard, not accusatory, simply steady. The voice she used when a child in her classroom was frightened and needed an anchor. I am not angry with you for not telling me, though I am going to need you to understand why that needs to change. But that conversation is for later. Right now I need to show you something. She turned the ledger around and slid it across the table toward him. He looked at the columns she had assembled. He turned to the back section, the one labeled for next year, and he read through it slowly, and she watched his face move through several expressions in succession, each one layered over the previous one like transparencies laid on top of each other, confusion becoming comprehension, becoming something that was dangerously close to being undone. Your sister, he said, has already written. The $60 is available whenever we need it. The grazing lease. The broker in Abilene says the going rate for winter grazing on unplanted acreage is approximately 40 cents per acre per month. We have nearly 60 acres that will sit empty through the winter. That is $24 a month if we can find a buyer for the grazing rights, which I believe we can. He turned another page. Turkey read. It is what the Russian Mennonites in McPherson County have been planting since they came over in 1874. The reports from those farms suggest it can withstand the drought conditions we experienced this summer significantly better than the spring wheat we have been planting. The seed is available, and I have a contact. We would need to convert some of our acreage to winter wheat planting next fall, but the yields on Turkey Red in a drought year are substantially better. Tobias sat back in his chair. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before on his face, or perhaps she had seen it and had not recognized it for what it was, a kind of profound reckoning, the look of a man who is revising an understanding of himself in real time against the reality of the person sitting across from him. How long have you been working on this? He asked. Since the second week of August. The silence that followed was long. The fire in the stove crackled. Outside, the wind moved across the flat Kansas land with its empty, ancient sound. I should have told you, he said finally. Yes, she said simply, you should have. I thought. He stopped. He looked at the table between them at his own hands. I thought it would frighten you. I thought it would make you wonder whether you had made a mistake, marrying me, coming out here. Celia looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her then, something that was half grief and half fierce, burning love, because she understood exactly what he had done and why he had done it and how much it had cost him, and she understood that the cost had been entirely unnecessary, and that the unnecessary cost was the most heartbreaking part of all. Tobias, she said, and her voice was quiet and careful and full of everything she was. I left Ohio on purpose. I came to Kansas on purpose. I married you on purpose. I have lived every day of these 3 years on purpose with my eyes open. I'm not a woman who married a farm. I married a man, and if the farm fails, I still have the man. Do you understand me? He looked at her. Do you understand me? She said again. Yes, he said, and his voice was rougher than usual. I understand you. Good. She stood up and went to the stove and ladled stew into 2 bowls. Now eat your supper. We have a great deal to discuss, and I think better with food in me. What followed over the next 2 hours was the most honest conversation they had ever had in 3 years of marriage, and it was also the conversation that changed the structural foundation of their partnership in ways that would hold them together through every subsequent difficulty, which were considerable, and which they weathered together. She laid out the plan in full. The $60 from Margaret would cover the most immediate portion of the bank loan, bringing the balance down to a manageable $90. The grazing lease revenue, if they could secure it quickly, would cover another $60 over the winter months. That left $30 of the loan balance plus the cost of next year's seed, which was the tighter problem, but Celia had been thinking about that too. I have not taken a salary from the school board this fall, she said, and watched his face change. Celia, let me explain before you object. I have been teaching on my regular arrangement through September and October, but I have spoken with the school board chairman, Mr. Hartley, about extending my hours. There are children in this county who need tutoring outside the regular school day. Children whose families are struggling enough that they cannot afford to send them to school consistently, and the children fall behind. I proposed a private tutoring arrangement for Saturday mornings, a flat rate per child per month, and Mr. Hartley agreed to let me use the schoolhouse. I have 3 families already committed and 2 more considering it. Tobias set down his spoon. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has discovered that the country he thought he knew has a whole unexplored territory on the other side of the mountain range. "You have been doing all of this," he said, "since August." "Since August," she confirmed. "While I was," he stopped. "While you were carrying it alone," she said gently. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I owe you an apology, several of them." "You owe me a promise," she corrected. "That the next time something is wrong, you tell me. Not when you have already solved it. Not when you have found a way to make it look smaller than it is. When it happens. When it is still frightening and there is no solution yet. That is when I need to know. Because you might see something I cannot see," he said slowly, and she could hear in his voice the work of a proud man learning something fundamental about the nature of his own pride, the way it had functioned not as strength but as isolation. "Because I am your wife," she said. "Because this is my farm too. Because every good thing we have built here we built together, and there is no version of this life where I am only present for the good parts." He looked at her for a long time. The lamplight moved across his face, across the tired lines beside his eyes and the jaw that she had once described to her sister as being made of the same material as the Kansas subsoil, dense and resistant and ultimately surprisingly rich once you got through the surface layer. "Promise me," she said. "I promise," he said. And Tobias Townsend, who had made very few promises in his life, because he understood that promises were a kind of debt, and he did not take debts lightly, meant it with everything in him. The next morning, they drove together to Hays City to speak with the bank. The bank manager, a careful man named Robert Cranick, who had been managing agricultural loans in Ellis County for going on a decade, and had seen every variety of farming disaster the Kansas plains could produce, listened to Celia's plan with the attentive, slightly surprised expression of a man who had not expected to be presented with a fully developed debt restructuring proposal by a farmer's wife at 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning. "Mrs. Townsend," he said, looking over the document she had produced, a clean and organized summary of the plan with the numbers laid out in 3 columns. "Where did you learn to do this?" "My father was a schoolmaster," she said. "He taught me mathematics and bookkeeping along with everything else, and I have always believed that the best way to address a problem is to understand it completely before proposing a solution." Cranick looked at Tobias. Tobias looked back at him with the expression of a man who has recently been educated about the full range of his wife's capabilities and is still in the early stages of processing it. "The plan is sound," Cranick said, setting the document on the desk. "I am prepared to extend the loan term by 6 months on the existing rate, provided you begin the grazing lease arrangement before the end of October. That gives you enough flexibility on the winter months." They shook hands across the desk, all 3 of them, which was unusual enough that Cranick's assistant looked up from the back of the office with an expression of mild bewilderment. On the way home in the wagon, with the October sun low and warm over the brown Kansas land, Tobias reached across and took her hand where it rested in her lap. She looked at their joined hands and then looked at his profile, at the long line of his jaw and the slight tension still remaining around his eyes. "You are not angry," he said. It was a statement, not a question, but it held a question inside it. "I was," she said honestly. "In August, when I realized you were not going to tell me, I was very angry. I walked out to the garden and pulled weeds for an hour so I would not say anything I could not take back." He absorbed this. "What changed?" She considered the question seriously because it deserved a serious answer. "I understood why you did it. I did not agree with it. I do not think your reasons were right, but I understood them. You were trying to protect me in the way you knew how to protect, which is to put yourself between the danger and the person you love and absorb the impact alone. The problem is that we are not built that way, this partnership. She gestured between them with her free hand. It is not built that way. It requires both of us to face the thing together. I know that now. I know you know it now. She squeezed his hand. That is why I am not angry anymore. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something she did not expect. It frightened me, he said. How much I need you. I have spent my whole life not needing anyone for anything important. And then you were there, and suddenly everything important was connected to you, and it frightened me. And the answer to that fear was to prove I could still handle everything alone. Celia turned to look at him fully. He kept his eyes on the road, on the horses moving through the late afternoon light, but his jaw was working with the effort of having said the thing. Tobias, she said, that is the most you have ever said to me about anything that matters. He looked at her then briefly, and the expression on his face was the one from the church doorway on their wedding day, the exposed, direct, slightly terrified sincerity of a man who has looked at something true. I am working on it, he said. I know, she said. I can see you working. She looked back at the road ahead of them, at the flat land opening out in all directions, enormous and indifferent and full of possibility. I like watching you work on it. They secured the grazing lease within the week. The arrangement was made with a cattle operation run by a man named Darnell Hayes, who was moving a small herd from western Kansas toward Abilene for the winter market and needed temporary pasture for the cows he was not selling. Tobias negotiated the rate himself, standing straight and direct and honest about what he needed, and Hayes, who respected directness, agreed to the terms without argument. The first lease payment came in 2 weeks later, $22 in hard money, and Tobias put it on the kitchen table in front of Celia with an expression that was equal parts satisfaction and rueful admission. You were right about the rate, he said. I usually am about numbers, she said pleasantly, and he gave her a look that was partly exasperated and mostly adoring. November brought the letter from Heinrich Unruh in McPherson County, responding to Celia's inquiry about turkey red seed. Unruh wrote in careful, formal English that he was pleased to assist neighboring farmers in understanding the benefits of the variety his community had brought from Russia, and that he would be willing to sell seed at a fair price, and also to provide, if they wished to visit, a demonstration of his family's planting methods, which had been refined over generations to work with the specific conditions of the Kansas climate rather than against them. Tobias read the letter twice. He is offering to show us how they do it, he said. Yes, Celia said. That is, he paused. That is generous. People are generous, she said, when you ask them honestly. They made the trip to McPherson County in the second week of November, a 2-day journey by wagon across the flat plains that took them through country that felt to Celia both foreign and deeply familiar. The same enormous sky and the same wide land, but with a different character. The German-Russian Mennonite farms laid out with a neatness and deliberateness that reflected their community's long experience with working difficult soil. Heinrich Unruh was a large, quietly spoken man in his 50s with a wife, who immediately fed them enough food for 6 people and children and grandchildren running through the yard in the cold November air. And he walked Tobias through his fields for 2 hours explaining, in his careful, methodical English, the principles of the turkey red variety, the way it went dormant through the worst of the winter, and then came alive again in the spring. The way its deep root system gave it access to moisture that the shallower-rooted spring wheat varieties could not reach. Tobias listened with an attention that Celia recognized as his truest mode of learning, still and focused and absorptive, asking questions that were simple and direct, and showed he had understood everything that came before. She walked beside them and listened to and took notes in the small notebook she carried everywhere, and Unruh occasionally directed a comment to her directly, with the matter-of-fact respect of a man who noted that she was paying attention and drew the logical conclusion. They bought enough turkey red seed for 60 acres to be planted the following fall. The price was fair, as Unruh had promised. They stayed the night at the Unruh farm, sleeping in a spare room that smelled of dried herbs and clean wool. And in the morning, Unruh's wife pressed a jar of her own preserved plums into Celia's hands and told her in mixed German and English that good farmers take care of their soil and good marriages take care of each other, which was so exactly the lesson of the past 2 months that Celia had to look at the middle distance for a moment to keep her composure. The drive home was 2 days of cold, clear November plains, the sky enormous above them, and the dried grass on either side of the track moving in the wind. They talked more on that drive than they had talked on any journey before, which was a function of having cleared the debris of the secret from between them and discovered how much space that opened up. He told her about his father. He had not spoken about his father since they were married, not in any depth, only the surface details. He told her about growing up watching his father rebuild after the war, the controlled intensity of the man, the way praise was something he gave out rarely and precisely, and therefore meant something enormous when it came, the way failure was treated not as catastrophe, but as information to be analyzed and corrected. He told her that he had internalized all of that, the precision and the drive and the refusal to concede defeat, but he had perhaps also internalized the silence around struggle, the performance of competence that papered over the cracks. He never asked for help, Tobias said, watching the horses. From anyone. He would work himself until he dropped before he would ask a neighbor to lend a hand, and people respected him for it. I always thought I was supposed to be the same. Your father rebuilt alone because he had no choice, Celia said carefully. He had lost everything and there was no one left who knew the shape of what he had lost. You are not in that situation. No, he said. I am not. You have me, she said simply. He looked at her then, and the look lasted long enough that she said gently, "Watch the road, Tobias." He looked back at the road, but she saw the corner of his mouth move. I have you, he said. And there was something in the way he said it that made it not a repetition but a recognition, as if he had known the fact intellectually for 3 years and was only now arriving at the full depth of what it meant. December came in with its particular Kansas silence, the snow flattening the sound of the world to a white hush, and they moved through the short cold days in the close companionship that the farmhouse created, close enough that every difference of opinion was felt immediately, and every moment of warmth was felt just as immediately. Tobias had always been a man who expressed affection through action more than words, through the firewood already stacked before she asked, and the horses already fed, and the extra blanket laid out at the end of the bed when the temperature dropped, and Celia had learned to read that language and to love it for what it was. But something had shifted since October. He was trying, deliberately and with visible effort, to add words to the actions, to say the things he meant instead of simply doing them and hoping they translated. On a December evening when the snow was coming down outside and the fire was burning low and golden, and the house smelled of the pine boughs she had hung along the kitchen shelf because she had grown up with that smell at Christmas and could not quite let go of it, he looked up from the account book he had been working through and said, unprompted, I am glad you came to Kansas. She looked up from the shirt she was mending. Are you? I think about it sometimes, he said. Where I would be if you had gotten off at a different town, if the train had been late, if you had been looking where you were walking. If I had been looking where I was walking, you would have gotten out of the door without dropping your list and we would never have spoken. Yes, he said, that is what I think about. She set down the mending. She looked at him across the lamplit kitchen, at the familiar face that she had watched change and deepen over 4 years, at the man who was still learning how to say the important things but was genuinely, persistently trying. I think about it too, she said. I was so frightened when I got on that train. I was 24 years old and I had just buried my father and I was going somewhere I had never been to do something I was not entirely certain I could do. I told myself it was brave. Mostly it was just that staying felt worse than going. Were you frightened? He asked, as if this was a new piece of information, which in some ways it was. She had never told him that part. Terrified, she said, every day for the first month. Not of the West, not of the work, but of the possibility that I had made a terrible mistake and I would have to live with it. Did you think it was a mistake? She smiled at him, and it was the kind of smile that held the whole complicated history of their 3 years in it. No, she said. Not once. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he got up from his chair and crossed the kitchen and bent and kissed her, which he was better at expressing through action than words, and this particular action was unambiguous and thoroughly expressed, and the mending sat on the table for quite some time before she got back to it. Spring came in its usual Kansas fashion, hesitant and then sudden, the brown land going softly green in the course of what felt like a single week. The Turner red seed they had purchased was laid by in the granary for the fall planting, and in the meantime they put in a spring crop that was smaller and more cautious than the previous year, pulling back to the best of their acreage rather than expanding and accepting the lower projected yield as a reasonable trade for the lower risk. The grazing lease revenue from the winter had paid down the bank loan significantly. Margaret's $60 had addressed another portion. The Saturday tutoring sessions had brought in a consistent trickle of income through the winter months that Celia had applied entirely to household expenses, freeing up Tobias's limited cash reserves for the farm operations. By April, they owed $40 to the bank, and had a clear path to paying it before the end of the growing season, even on the reduced crop. "We are going to be all right," Tobias said one April morning, standing at the kitchen window looking out at the new green of the south field. "We were always going to be all right," Celia said from the stove. "I was quite confident of that." He turned to look at her. "Were you, in October, when you sat down with that ledger?" She considered being diplomatic and decided against it. "Honestly, I was frightened. I was frightened enough that I did not want you to see me being frightened because I thought if we were both frightened at once it would be difficult to think clearly." He was quiet for a moment. "We should have been frightened together." "Yes," she said. "We should have been. Next time we will be." "Next time," he said dryly, "I am hoping the harvest does not fail." "The harvest will fail again eventually," she said practically. "That is the nature of farming in Kansas. We will face bad years. The question is not whether we face them. The question is how." He crossed the kitchen and stood behind her and put his hands on her shoulders and his mouth against the side of her hair, and she leaned back into him slightly without looking away from the pot she was stirring. "Together," he said. "Together," she agreed. It was in May of that year that they received the news that changed the immediate landscape of their plans in a way that was not connected to farming at all. Celia had been feeling tired in a particular way that she recognized from the accounts of her married friends back in Ohio. A bone-deep fatigue that arrived in the mornings with a specificity and persistence that was different from the ordinary tiredness of hard work. She consulted Dr. Miriam Galbraith, one of 2 physicians in Hays City, and the one she preferred because Galbraith was both competent and unhurried. A woman in her 40s who had come to Kansas from Philadelphia with her doctor husband who had died of typhoid in 1879, and who had simply stayed and continued practicing, building a reputation for careful, honest medicine that the county's homesteading women trusted. Galbraith confirmed what Celia had already privately suspected. She was expecting their first child, due in December. She sat in the wagon outside Galbraith's office for a few minutes before driving home, not because she was frightened, though she was some, but because she wanted to feel the magnitude of it for a moment before she went back to the ordinary details of the day. The sky was enormous above her. The prairie wind moved her hair. She thought of her father, who would have loved this news, and she allowed herself a moment of grief for his absence before setting it aside and picking up the reins. Tobias was in the south field when she got home. She walked out to him across the damp spring ground, and he looked up from the fence post he was setting and read something in her face immediately, because he had been paying better attention since October. "What is it?" he said. "We are going to need that second bedroom for something other than storage by December," she said. He stood very still for a moment. The fence post was in one hand and the mallet was in the other, and he looked like a man who has been struck by something invisible, something that has gone through the armor and hit the real center. Then he set down the fence post and the mallet very carefully, and he walked to her, and he put his arms around her and held on, not dramatically, not with any performance, simply with the whole strength of him, and she felt him breathe in and out once slowly, the breath of a man taking in something that is too big for ordinary air. "December," he said into her hair. "December," she confirmed. "Dr. Galbraith says probably mid-December." He pulled back just enough to look at her face. His expression was entirely open. No armor, no performance, just Tobias in his full, unguarded reality. And what was there was something she could only describe later in a letter to her sister as the specific joy of a man who has been given something he did not know he was waiting for. "We need to expand the house again," he said. She laughed, which surprised them both. "That is your first thought." "The room will need to be warm," he said with complete seriousness. "The kitchen extension faces south, which is good, but we should add insulation to the west wall before winter." She kissed him. He stopped talking about insulation. The summer of 1885 was better than the summer of 1884 in every respect that mattered. The rains came in July, not abundant but sufficient, and the spring wheat they had planted on the reduced acreage came up strong and reasonably, even, and by late August was heading out in a way that made Tobias walk the rows twice a day, not from anxiety, but from the pleasure of watching something go right. He reported faithfully to Celia each evening on the status of the fields, not because she could not walk out and see for herself, but because the reporting had become a practice between them, a daily recounting of the state of things that served as both practical information and a kind of ritual affirmation that they were facing the land together. She grew through the summer months and into the fall with the same practical, forward-moving quality that she brought to everything, making adjustments to the household routines and the schoolteacher schedule, negotiating with the school board a reduction in her hours through the winter term, which they granted without difficulty, because she was the best teacher they had employed in the county's brief history, and they were not interested in losing her. She continued the Saturday tutoring until October, when the physical demands of the late pregnancy made the drive to the schoolhouse inadvisable in cold weather, and she set that income aside in the account she privately thought of as the seed fund, the money earmarked for the turkey red planting in the coming fall. The harvest in September of 1885 was not spectacular, but it was real. It paid off the remaining $40 of the bank loan and left enough in reserve to cover the winter household expenses with a modest surplus. When Tobias handed Robert Cranick the final payment in full, Cranick shook his hand and said, with the particular dry warmth of a man who has seen many farming families struggle, and not all of them make it through, "You have a capable partner, Mr. Townsend." "I know that," Tobias said. And the way he said it made Cranick look up from his ledger, because it was not the tone of a man conceding a point, but of a man stating something he held as a fundamental truth. Their son was born on the 14th of December, 1885, during a Kansas snowstorm that was not severe enough to prevent Dr. Galbraith from making the drive out to the farm, but was severe enough to make the drive interesting. Tobias sat in the kitchen during the hours of the labor, unable to eat and unable to stay still, walking from the stove to the window and back with a regularity that would have been comical in other circumstances. And when the sound from the bedroom finally changed and resolved into the unmistakable thin, fierce announcement of a new person arriving in the world, he stopped in the middle of the kitchen floor and stood there with his hands at his sides, breathing. Galbraith came to the kitchen door after a few minutes. "You have a healthy son," she said. "Both your wife and your boy are doing very well. You can go in." He looked down at the baby in Celia's arms, small and red-faced and emphatically alive, and then he looked at his wife, who was exhausted and radiant in the specific way of women who have just done the most demanding and significant thing a human body can do. He sat on the edge of the bed and she leaned against him, and the baby made the small working sounds of a person adjusting to existence. And Tobias looked at his family in the lamplight of the bedroom he had built with his own hands in the house he had built with his own hands in the middle of the enormous, indifferent, occasionally catastrophic Kansas plains. And he felt something settle in him that had been unsettled since his mother first told him that his pride would either build him an empire or bury him. He thought it had done neither, exactly. He thought, with the clarity that only comes in particular moments, that it had instead nearly kept him from the most important things he had ever been part of, and that the things that had saved him were not his own strength or his own stubbornness, but a woman with gray eyes and a ledger, and the patience to let him find his way to the truth while she quietly built the road he would need to walk back on. "What shall we call him?" Celia asked. "You choose," he said. She had thought about this as she thought about most things with a quiet thoroughness. "James," she said. "After my father," she paused. "If you agree." "James," he said, tasting the name. "James Townsend." He looked at the baby. "Yes, that fits." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "James it is," she said. James Townsend grew through the winter months with the determined, voracious energy of a person with plans, and the household around him adjusted to his presence with the slightly chaotic grace of two people who are competent at most things, discovering that a baby is a different category of challenge entirely. Tobias turned out to be better at the early mornings than either of them had anticipated, which surprised him as much as it surprised Celia, and she later told her sister that watching her husband walk the kitchen at 2 in the morning with the baby against his shoulder, his large hand covering nearly the entire back of the small body, talking in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular because the voice was the point rather than the words, was one of the most privately devastating things she had ever witnessed, in the best possible way. The spring planting of 1886 went according to plan. The turkey red seed went into the ground in the fall of that year as scheduled, 60 acres of it, planted using the methods Unruh had demonstrated, with the care and precision that the Mennonite farmer had emphasized, were as important as the seed itself. Unruh had written a follow-up letter over the summer with additional notes on soil preparation, and Tobias had read the letter 3 times and implemented every suggestion with the attentive thoroughness of a man who has learned the value of listening to someone who knows more than he does. The summer of 1886 was hot and dry, not as catastrophic as 1884, but not generous. The spring wheat planted on the remaining acreage came through adequately. The turkey red, putting its energy into root development through the summer in preparation for the fall, simply waited, as Unruh had said it would, with the patience of a variety that had been bred over centuries to cooperate with difficult conditions rather than to fight them. Through these months, Celia had returned to teaching full-time, bringing James with her for the first months, and then, as he grew into a toddler with strong opinions about remaining stationary, arranging for one of her older students, a capable 14-year-old girl named Rosa Diaz, whose family farmed 3 miles outside town, to care for James in the mornings in exchange for extra tutoring hours that Rosa was putting toward the hope of becoming a teacher herself one day. Rosa Diaz was the daughter of a Mexican family who had settled in Ellis County in the early years of the decade. Her father, a skilled horseman, who worked at one of the larger cattle operations in the county, and her mother, a woman of formidable competence who ran their small homestead, and 6 children, with an efficiency that made even Celia occasionally feel insufficient by comparison. The Diaz family occupied the uncomfortable position of many families of Mexican heritage in the Anglo-dominated social landscape of 1880s Kansas, useful and respected for their skills, and simultaneously subject to the low-grade friction of a society that was still deciding who belonged and who did not. Celia was aware of this. In the particular way, she was aware of the similar friction experienced by the freedmen homesteaders in the county, as an injustice that her small position as schoolteacher allowed her to address in limited but real ways. And she addressed it where she could, in the classroom, in the tutoring arrangements, in the deliberate inclusion of every child in the county in the education she provided regardless of the background of their family. The turkey red harvest in the fall of 1886 was the moment when everything Celia had set in motion in October of 1884 came fully into view. The yield on the 60 acres was nearly double what the spring wheat had produced on comparable acreage in a comparable year. Not because the season had been generous, but because the variety was built for the conditions, and the conditions were exactly what they had faced for 2 years running. Tobias walked the rows at harvest with an expression of concentrated, quiet wonder, running his hand along the heads of wheat that were heavier and more numerous than anything he had grown on this land before. And he thought about Celia in August of 1884, walking these same fields alone, counting rows and estimating yields, and writing to seed merchants in Topeka, building the solution while he was still constructing the pretense that there was no problem. He came home from the harvest with $50 above the break-even point for the first time since they had started farming, and he put it on the kitchen table in the same spot where she had once spread the ledger across from him, and he looked at her and he said, "This is yours. You grew this." She looked at the money and then at him. "We grew it," she said. "You found the seed," he said. "You found Unruh. You saw 2 years ago what needed to change, and you changed it while I was still too proud to admit the thing that needed changing was already broken." She sat down across from him. James was asleep in the next room. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window they had enlarged the previous spring, warm and golden on the table between them. "You changed too," she said. "That matters as much as the seed." He looked at her. "The first year," she said, "you would not have listened if I had laid this plan in front of you. You would have been grateful and resistant, and you would have found a way to take the plan apart and rebuild it yourself until it felt like yours. You know that is true." He considered this honestly. "Yes," he said, "probably. October changed you," she said. "Not just the failure, the talking, the sitting across from each other in the dark and saying the real things. That changed you. That is what made the turkey red possible, not just as a crop but as something we decided together." He looked at his hands on the table, at the familiar roughness of them. Then he looked up at her. "I love you," he said. It was not the first time he had said it, but it was the first time he said it in this particular register, without it being a response to her saying it first, without the slight defensive cover of routine, simply direct and voluntary and unqualified. She looked at him steadily. "I love you," she said back, with the same quality of intention. They sat for a moment in the good silence that they had built between them, the kind of silence that is full rather than empty. And outside the kitchen window the Kansas afternoon was golden and enormous, and theirs. James Townsend took his first unassisted steps in the kitchen of the farmhouse in November of 1886. Crossing from the chair leg he was using as a support to his father's outstretched hands, in a series of 4 wobbling, concentrated steps that sent him crashing triumphantly into Tobias's arms, to the great applause of both parents, and the particular satisfaction of a boy who has been watching the adult world walk past him for 11 months and has finally decided to join it. "He is going to be fast," Tobias said, holding the boy up level with his face. James grabbed a handful of his father's dark hair with the decisive grip of a person establishing ownership, and Tobias winced and laughed simultaneously. "He is going to be stubborn," Celia said, watching from the kitchen table with the cup of coffee she allowed herself in the afternoons. "Look at his jaw." Tobias looked at the jaw in question. Then he looked at his wife with an expression of someone who recognizes the accusation as accurate. "He gets that from you," he said. "From me," she said serenely. "Entirely from me." The winter of 1886 into 1887 was their most comfortable yet. Not wealthy by any standard, but stable in a way that felt profoundly different from the anxiety of the previous winters. The house was warmer, The provisions were adequate. The wood was stacked high and dry. Tobias had hired a seasonal farmhand for the harvest, a young man of 20 named Peter Halst, whose family farmed in the next county, and who turned out to be both competent and cheerful, which were the two qualities Tobias had specified when asking around for help. And Peter's wages had been paid from the harvest surplus without strain. In January, Celia wrote to her sister Margaret to report the year's outcomes and to repay the $60 with the added sum of $10 interest, which Margaret had not asked for but which Celia insisted on because she had been raised by a man who believed that debts, including debts of love, should be honored in full. Margaret wrote back almost immediately with the warmth and slightly overwhelming enthusiasm that had always characterized her correspondence, and the letter included, toward the end, the casual mention that she had told a friend who was married to an agricultural journalist about the Turkey red wheat and the success the Townsend farm had experienced, and that the friend's husband was interested in writing a piece for the Kansas Farmer newspaper about the variety and its performance on Ellis County homesteads. Celia read this paragraph to Tobias over supper. He set down his spoon. "An article in the paper," he said. "About the farm," she said. "About the Turkey red specifically. The journalist is interested in whether the variety can address the drought vulnerability that other Ellis County farmers are experiencing." Tobias thought about this. "Other farmers had the same problems in 1884, he said slowly. "The same drought, the same grasshoppers. Many of them are still struggling with the same variety," Celia said. "They had no reason to know about Turkey red. No one had told them. Unruh told us. Unruh told us because I wrote to him," she said. "There is no reason other farmers could not benefit from the same information." Tobias was quiet for a moment. He was thinking. She could see him thinking, and she waited because she had learned that when he went quiet in this particular way, something real was in the process of forming. "We could invite people to see the fields," he said. "In the spring when the winter wheat is coming up. Farmers in the county who want to understand what they are looking at." "That is an excellent idea," she said, and kept her voice level even though she was internally delighted, because this was exactly the kind of generosity he was capable of when his pride was not in the way, the instinct to share something useful rather than to hoard the advantage. "You already thought of this," he said. "I had wondered if you might suggest something like it," she admitted. He gave her the look, the specific look that was partly exasperated and mostly illuminated, the look of a man who has accepted that the woman across from him is several steps ahead of him on most paths and has made peace with that reality in a way that he has chosen to find admirable rather than threatening. "When," he said, "did I become entirely predictable to you?" "Predictable is the wrong word," she said. "You are not predictable, but I know you. There is a difference." "What is the difference?" "Predictable means I can guess what you will do. Knowing you means I understand why you will do it, which lets me see the shape of the thing before it arrives." She smiled at him. "You are a man who, given the right conditions, will always choose generosity over advantage. I knew that before you did." He looked at her for a long moment. "You knew that before I did," he repeated. "Yes, because you were watching." "Because I love you," she said simply. "Watching is what love does." The spring gathering at the Townsend farm was held on a Saturday in April, organized through a notice in the Hays City newspaper and by word of mouth through the farming community of Ellis County. 12 families came, some driving considerable distances, arriving in wagons with children and dogs, and the slightly awkward formality of people who are gathering for something educational and are not entirely sure of the social protocol. Tobias showed them the Turkey red fields, the winter wheat that had come up through March in rows that were visibly stronger and more consistent than what most of them had growing in their own fields. He explained Unruh's planting methods in the straightforward, concrete way that farmers speaking to farmers find most useful, without embellishment and without condescension. He answered questions directly. When he did not know an answer, he said so, and directed the question to Celia, who was walking the field alongside the group and who frequently did know the answer. At the end of the morning, Celia served coffee and cornbread on the kitchen table she had extended with 2 boards to accommodate a larger group, and the gathering turned into a conversation about the specific challenges of Ellis County farming, and who had tried what, and what had worked and what had not, and several families left with the name of Heinrich Unruh in McPherson County, and an understanding of how to contact him about turkey red seed. One of those families was the Ackafer family, Jacob and Ruth Ackafer, freedmen homesteaders who had taken up a claim 2 counties over, and who had come to the gathering, after reading the notice in the paper, with the quiet determination of people who are accustomed to taking every useful opportunity because the alternatives are harder and the margin is thinner. Jacob Ackafer asked precise, intelligent questions about soil preparation, and Tobias answered them with the same respect and directness he gave every other question, which was neither remarkable to him nor, Celia noticed, unremarked upon by everyone present. The social geography of the frontier was complicated and sometimes ugly, and moments of simple decency were not invisible to those who had learned to look for them. Ruth Ackafer paused at the kitchen door as they were leaving and said to Celia, "This was a generous thing to do." "It was practical," Celia said. "If the farms around us are stronger, the whole county is stronger. It was in our own interest." Ruth smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who appreciated the framing. "Practical generosity is the best kind," she said. They corresponded after that, Celia and Ruth Ackafer, letters that moved between Ellis County and the neighboring county with the slow regularity of the frontier mail system, exchanging information about seeds and markets and the particular challenges each family was facing. It was the beginning of a friendship that would last decades and would eventually lead, years later, to Celia attending the wedding of the Ackafer's eldest daughter with the same wholehearted celebration she brought to every significant occasion. The agricultural journalist did come, in June of 1887, a careful, bookish man from Topeka named Edward Farwell, who spent 2 days at the Townsend farm asking questions with a methodical thoroughness that Celia respected, and who published his article in the Kansas Farmer in August to considerable circulation among the farming community of central and western Kansas. The article mentioned the Townsend farm by name and described, with Tobias's permission, the 1884 harvest failure and the recovery that had followed. Tobias had agreed to this description after some internal resistance, and Celia had watched him agree and had felt something warm move through her, because the willingness to let the failure be part of the public story, rather than hiding it behind the success, was itself evidence of how far he had traveled from the man who had sat across from her in October of 1884 with his face in his hands. "It might help someone," he said, when he agreed to it. "Knowing that someone else had the same failure and came through, it will help many people," she said. "Then it is worth saying." The years that followed the turkey red harvest built outward from that foundation, with the gradual, sturdy progress of things that have been properly rooted. They planted more acres each year as the returns allowed, and then hired Peter Halst on permanently as a farmhand when the operation grew beyond what Tobias alone could manage in the busy seasons. And Peter, who had a talent for machinery and a steady work ethic, became a fixture of the farm and eventually of the household's daily life in the way that good hired hands on farming operations sometimes do. Not family exactly, but something adjacent to it. James Townsend grew into a boy who had his father's jaw and his mother's gray eyes, and a personality that combined Tobias's focused intensity with Celia's quick, lateral intelligence in a way that was occasionally alarming in a child of 6, and promised to be formidable in a grown man. He followed his father in the fields and his mother in the schoolroom with equal enthusiasm, absorbing both worlds with the appetite of a person who is genuinely interested in everything. In the fall of 1889, when James was nearly 4, Celia told Tobias over supper that they were expecting again. She said it over supper because she had decided there was no reason to make a production of it, and also because she was not entirely sure how she felt about it herself, being now 31 and fully occupied with the teaching and the farm, and the raising of one small person who was already a full-time occupation on his own. Tobias set down his fork with the careful deliberateness of a man ensuring it was placed correctly before looking up. "How are you feeling?" he said, and the question landed with such exact accuracy on the center of what she needed to be asked that she looked at him with an expression he recognized as surprise. "Tired," she said honestly. "Glad. Slightly overwhelmed." All three at once. "All right," he said. "What do we need to change?" She had a list. Of course she had a list. She had been thinking it through since she had confirmed it with Dr. Galbraith the previous week, and the list covered the household adjustments and the school board conversation, and the question of Peter Halse taking on additional farm responsibilities through the spring. She walked him through it, and he listened with the full attention she had come to know as one of the things she loved most about him, and he asked questions and agreed to the adjustments, and at the end he reached across the table and took her hand. "Together," he said. "Together," she said. Their second child was a daughter, born in April of 1890, the Kansas spring coming through the windows of the farmhouse in a rush of warm air and the smell of turned earth. They named her Clara, after no one in particular, but because the name felt bright and clear, which was how she arrived, with a distinctly serene quality for a newborn that Dr. Galbraith remarked on with the professional skepticism of someone who had delivered a great many infants and knew that serenity was a temporary condition. Clara's serenity lasted longer than Galbraith had predicted. She was a watchful, contented baby who observed the world from whatever spot she had been placed with an attentive stillness that Tobias found both charming and slightly unnerving. "She looks at me like she is taking notes," he said one evening, watching Clara regard him from her blanket on the kitchen floor with focused gray eyes that were unmistakably her mother's. "She is," Celia said from across the kitchen, and he could hear her smiling. "Get used to it." James, who had been watching the arrival of his sister with the complex mix of excitement and proprietorial uncertainty that older children bring to the project of siblings, was converted within a week by Clara's apparently bottomless appreciation for being looked at by her brother, and he appointed himself her primary protector and educator with an authority that no one had granted him, but that he exercised with complete confidence. The farm by 1891 was a genuinely different proposition from the homestead Tobias had filed his claim on in 1882. The original 160 acres had been expanded through the purchase of an adjacent claim from a family who had given up and gone back east after 3 difficult years, and they were now farming something close to 240 acres, with a rotation of turkey red winter wheat and feed corn, and a small kitchen garden that had become, under Celia's continued attention, a serious productive operation in its own right, supplying not only their household but a regular surplus that she sold at the Hayes City Market on Friday mornings. They had rebuilt the house again, properly this time, with a second floor containing 2 bedrooms and a proper hallway, and a wraparound porch that Tobias had built over the course of a summer, and that Celia used in every season for which outdoor sitting was physiologically possible, which in Kansas was more seasons than most people expected. It was on this porch that she did her reading and her correspondence and her preparation for the school week, and it was there that Tobias found her most evenings, after the work was done, and joined her in the good silence that continued to be one of the most comfortable features of their life together. In the summer of 1892, Heinrich Unruh came to visit the Townsend farm. He came with his eldest son Gustav and spent 2 days looking at the turkey-red fields with the pride of a man who has shared something valuable and watched it take root in new soil. He and Tobias walked the fields together for hours, talking in the way that farmers talk, which is technically about soil and seed and weather, but is actually about meaning, about the investment of a life in a piece of land, and what that investment says about what a person believes is worth doing. At supper the second evening, Unruh said something that Tobias later told Celia had stayed with him. They had been talking about the difficult years, 1884 and 1885, and the recovery, and Unruh had said, in his careful English that had become more fluid over the decade they had corresponded, "The drought does not care about your pride. The grasshopper does not care. The only thing that survives a catastrophe is the thing that knows how to ask for what it needs." Tobias had looked across the table at Celia, who was listening to Unruh and nodding, and he had said, quietly and with a meaning Unruh had not quite caught but that Celia understood completely, "I know. I learned that." Unruh looked between them with the perceptive warmth of an older man who has been married for 30 years and recognizes the particular shorthand of people who have been through something significant together. "Good," he said simply, and refilled Tobias's coffee cup. The decade turned. James Townsend grew into a teenager who could drive the harvest wagon and calculate bushel per acre yields in his head, and who had discovered a passion for the new agricultural science that was beginning to come out of the Kansas State Agricultural College in Manhattan. Reading every publication he could find about soil improvement and irrigation methods, with the hungry focus his parents both recognized as the family characteristic. Clara grew into a girl who had her father's capacity for focused physical work, and her mother's insistence on understanding the reason behind every rule she was given, which made her an interesting classroom student and an occasionally challenging household member. And Celia privately predicted to her sister, a woman of considerable capability in whatever field she eventually chose. In the fall of 1894, Celia sat at the kitchen table and opened a letter from the Kansas State Agricultural College that made her sit very still for a moment before she read it a second time. The letter was in response to an inquiry she had made the previous spring, through a contact she had developed through the Kansas Farmer Network, about the possibility of establishing a model demonstration farm in Ellis County that would serve as a practical education resource for local farmers, particularly for the families who were still struggling with drought conditions and outdated planting methods. She had written the inquiry with the same organized clarity she brought to everything, outlining the proposal in 3 sections with projected benefits and estimated costs, and the names of several local farming families who had indicated interest. The response was positive. The college was expanding its experimental station network and was looking for county-level partners to host demonstration plots. The Townsend Farm, with its documented history of turkey red wheat cultivation and its established relationship with the surrounding farming community, was an ideal candidate. She read the letter a 3rd time, and then a 4th, and then she got up and went out to find Tobias. He was in the equipment barn, doing maintenance on the thrashing machine, with the focused absorption of a man who finds mechanical problem-solving genuinely pleasurable. He looked up when she came in, reading her expression immediately in the way that 10 years of paying attention had built into the architecture of his perception. "Good news," she said, holding out the letter. He wiped his hands on the rag and took it, and she watched his face move through the text, watched his eyes go back to the beginning and move through it again. "A demonstration farm," he said. "In partnership with the college," she said. They would contribute research materials and a supervising agronomist who would visit quarterly. We would provide the land and the management. Families from the county could come and see the results firsthand. He lowered the letter and looked at her. 10 years of marriage, 2 children, 1 catastrophic harvest and 1 remarkable recovery, a house rebuilt twice, and a farm expanded past anything he had imagined in 1882 with the $200 in his boot, and the mule and the particular, stubborn, magnificent certainty that he could make something here on this difficult land. "This is the thing you have been working toward," he said. For a long time. She considered denying it and decided that was unnecessary. For several years, she confirmed. I thought about it first the spring after we came back from Unruh's farm, when I saw what it meant to the other families who came to our open day. The information that would have saved that 1884 harvest was available. No one had connected the right people to the right knowledge. I wanted to build a place that did that connecting as a matter of course. He looked at the letter again. Then he looked at her, and on his face was the expression she had first seen in a Kansas field in August of 1882, the expression of a man who has looked at something true and cannot look away. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. "We will do it," he said. "Whatever you need to make it happen. The South Field is the best demonstration plot. The soil there is the most consistent, and it is visible from the road. We should put up a proper fence for the demonstration plots, something that reads as deliberate and organized from the outside. We might also think about a small structure, something between a barn and a classroom where people can gather when the weather does not cooperate." She kissed him, in the equipment barn, among the thrashing machine parts and the smell of machine oil and hay, because after 10 years she still found the moment when his careful mind committed to something and began to run with it one of the most compelling things she had ever witnessed, and she had no intention of pretending otherwise. He paused in his planning. "I was thinking out loud," he said. "I know," she said. "Keep going." He did. The Ellis County Demonstration Farm, affiliated with the Kansas State Agricultural College, opened formally in the spring of 1896, with a gathering that was considerably larger and more organized than the informal field day of 1887, and that drew families from several surrounding counties. The supervising agronomist, a practical and enthusiastic young man from Manhattan named Dr. Samuel Webb, had come several weeks early to help with the preparations, and had turned out to be both genuinely knowledgeable and entirely unbothered by Celia's habit of asking highly specific questions that occasionally required him to go back to his reference books, which he did without embarrassment and which earned her respect. James Townsend, now 11 years old, appointed himself Dr. Webb's unofficial assistant, and spent every available hour following the agronomist through the demonstration plots with the focused attention of a person who is currently deciding what his life is going to be about. Webb, who had no children of his own and a great deal of genuine enthusiasm for agricultural science, was happy to explain every process to a boy who was actually listening. And the result was an education that supplemented Celia's schoolroom with a very specific and useful practical dimension. The demonstration farm opening was written up in the Kansas Farmer and in the Hays City newspaper, and the description included, at Tobias's deliberate and voluntary suggestion, the story of the 1884 harvest failure and what had followed, the full account, the pride, the kept secret, the wife who already knew and was already solving it, the turkey red wheat and the Unruh connection and the eventual recovery. He told it plainly, without self-pity and without false modesty, and the version of it that appeared in the newspaper was read by a considerable number of Ellis County farming families who found in it the specific comfort that comes from learning that someone else has been in the same dark place and found their way out. "You let them print all of it," Celia said when she read the article. "Yes," he said, "the part about not telling me." "Yes." She folded the newspaper carefully. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because that is the part that matters most," he said. "Any man can plant a better wheat variety. The harder thing is learning to put the thing you cannot solve in front of the person who might help you solve it. If someone reads that and it helps them do that, it was worth saying." She looked at him. He was 45 years old now, the lines beside his eyes deeper, the dark hair carrying threads of silver at the temples, the same jaw and the same dark eyes and the same quality of absolute directness when he chose to use it. He was not a different man from the one who had sat across from her in the lamplight with his face in his hands, but he was a more complete version of that man, as if the years of learning to say the true things had filled in dimensions that had been only suggested before. "I am very glad I collided with you at the general store," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "I was not looking where I was walking." "Neither was I," she said, "as I believe I acknowledged at the time." "We shared the fault equally," he said, and now the mouth had moved all the way to a smile, the real one that she had been collecting for 14 years and still found remarkable every time it appeared. "We share most things equally," she said. "We have gotten better at it." "Considerably better," he agreed. In the years that followed, the Townsend farm continued to grow and to serve as something that had not quite existed in Ellis County before. A place where practical agricultural knowledge and community connection happened together, where the open field days became an annual event, and the small structure Tobias had built between a barn and a classroom was used through the winter months for gatherings where farmers talked through their plans and their problems with the benefit of the demonstration farms, accumulated experience, and Dr. Webb's quarterly visits. James Townsend enrolled at the Kansas State Agricultural College in Manhattan in 1903, which was a source of the particular pride that his parents had spent his entire life attempting to express with some dignity, with limited success. He came home for the harvests and the demonstrations and wrote letters through the school terms that were detailed and enthusiastic and occasionally highly technical, in a way that caused Tobias to bring them to Celia and say, "What is he talking about here?" with the tone of a man who is secretly pleased to have produced a child who has outstudied him. Clara Townsend, who grew into precisely the formidable young woman her mother had predicted, showed early and sustained aptitude for medicine, encouraged by Dr. Galbraith, who was still practicing in Hayes City in her 70s with the same calm authority, and who took an active interest in the Townsend girl who asked better questions than most of her adult patients. Clara left for nursing training in Topeka in 1906, and Celia saw her off at the train station with the composed expression of a woman who was profoundly proud and would do her crying in private, which she did, on the wraparound porch with the September prairie wind coming in from the west. Tobias found her there. He sat down beside her without comment and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat on the porch they had built together and watched the afternoon light move across the fields below. "She is going to be extraordinary," he said. "I know," Celia said. "That makes it harder, not easier." He tightened his arm around her. "She gets it from you," he said. "From both of us," she said. "Do not be modest. It does not suit you." He made a sound that was somewhere between acknowledgement and argument, which was one of the sounds she had collected over 24 years, and which she had never once found anything other than exactly right. In the winter of 1908, Heinrich Unruh died in McPherson County at the age of 76, full of years and good work, and Tobias and Celia drove to McPherson County for the funeral with the snow coming softly down on the flat land around them, and the horses steady in the traces. They sat in the Mennonite church and listened to the service, which was partly in German that Tobias did not speak, but understood something of through the cadence and the familiar faces of people grieving someone they loved well, and when they drove home Tobias was quiet for a long time. "He gave us the seed," Tobias finally said. "He did," Celia said. "He gave us more than that," Tobias said. "He showed us what it looked like to share knowledge without holding on to the advantage of it. He gave it away because that was the right thing to do with something valuable." "Yes," she said. "That is what we have been doing," he said, "with the demonstration farm." "Yes," she said again. He looked at her profile against the winter fields. "You saw that," he said, "in 1887, before I did." "I was watching," she said. "Watching is what love does." He reached over and covered her hand with his where it rested on the seat between them, and they drove home through the soft Kansas snow in the good silence that had been the most constant and most valuable thing they had built. Not the farm or the wheat or the demonstration plots, but the silence that was full of knowing each other completely and choosing to be there anyway, every morning, every season, every year. The harvest of 1910 was the finest in the history of the Townsend farm. The turkey red variety, now planted by dozens of Ellis County families following the demonstration farms model, produced yields that justified every letter Celia had written in 1884, and every seed purchased from Heinrich Unruh, and every open field day, and every Kansas farmer article, and every hour of the slow, persistent, love-driven project of building something durable on difficult land. James came home for that harvest, bringing with him a young woman named Helen Park, who was the daughter of a Manhattan banker, and who had the calm, intelligent eyes of someone who has thought carefully about the life she is choosing and has concluded that it is worth choosing. Celia recognized the expression immediately, having worn it herself on a train platform in 1882. She spoke with Helen in the kitchen on the second evening, while Tobias and James walked the fields in the last light. "He has told me about the farm," Helen said, "about growing up here, about what his parents built." "He probably made it sound more dramatic than it was," Celia said. "He said that his father nearly lost everything in 1884 and his mother saved it without his father knowing she was doing it," Helen said. "He says that is the story of this farm." Celia was quiet for a moment, cutting the bread for supper. Then she said, "That is one version of the story. Is there another?" "Yes," Celia said. "The other version is that his father, when confronted with the truth of what had happened, chose to say it out loud instead of pretending it away. And that was harder, I think, than any of the growing or building or planting. The other version is that we learned how to face things together, which took longer than one harvest and one conversation, but which has held up for 26 years. She looked at the younger woman. "That is the version worth knowing." Helen looked at her with the clear, assessing gaze that Celia liked very much. "Both versions require the same thing," Helen said. "Two people deciding to be honest with each other about what is real." "Yes," Celia said. "Exactly that." Helen and James were married in the spring of 1911, in the same Hayes City Methodist Church where Tobias and Celia had married 25 years earlier, with rather more guests and considerably more flowers, because Celia had kept a friendship with the florist's wife for 15 years, and the flowers were offered with the generous excess of someone who enjoys a romantic occasion and has the inventory to express it. Tobias stood beside his son at the front of the church, and the expression on his face was one that Celia, watching from the first pew, had to memorize carefully because it was made of too many things to hold all at once. The pride of a father, the recognition of continuity, the particular joy of a man who has made something good and knows it, and underneath all of it the trace of the younger man who had stood in this same doorway in September of 1884 and told a woman in a blue dress with wildflowers that she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. She caught his eye across the church, and something passed between them in the instantaneous, wordless way of two people who have been paying attention to each other for 25 years. A full conversation compressed into the space of a glance, and he smiled at her, the real smile, and she smiled back. Their grandson arrived in the winter of 1912, a boy named Henry after no one in particular, but because Helen had a feeling about it and she had, Celia told James admiringly, excellent judgment. Tobias held Henry in the kitchen of the old farmhouse, which was now the larger, fuller, porch-trapped house that had grown around the original structure like rings in a tree, and looked down at the face of a new generation with the same still, profound expression he had worn when James arrived in this same room 27 years before. "Another farmer," he said. "Possibly," Celia said, standing beside him with her hand on his arm. "Or something else entirely. Let him find out." "Yes," he said. "Let him find out." Outside the kitchen window, the Kansas winter had laid its white silence over the fields where the turkey red was resting under the cold, waiting for the spring it knew would come. The wheat would come up in March, as it always did, with the patient certainty of something that has been bred over centuries to cooperate with the difficult conditions of a difficult land. The fields would fill with the green of it, and then with the gold of it, and the harvest would come as it always came, some years generous and some years not, and the people who worked the land would face what came together or they would not, and the difference between those two things would be the difference between everything. The lamp on the kitchen table burned gold and steady. The baby made the small working sounds of a new person adjusting to a large world. The house stood solid around its people on the flat Kansas earth, built of good materials and better intentions, and the woman and the man who had built it stood together in the light they had made. Celia thought of the ledger, open on this table on an October evening in 1884, of the numbers in the back section labeled for next year, of the letters she had written and the plan she had assembled, and the moment when her husband had walked through the door covered in the dust of a failed harvest and she had not looked up. She thought of how frightened she had been, how certain, how determined, despite the fear, to find the road through. She thought of everything that had followed, the conversation and the promise, the bank and the grazing lease, the drive to McPherson County in the November cold, the turkey red coming up through the spring earth with its patient, drought-resistant roots sunk deep into the difficult ground. She thought of Tobias saying, 26 years ago, that he could not think of a single good reason she should not marry him. She had thought of one or two at the time. She had married him anyway. She put her hand over his where it held the baby, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and the things they did not need to say were as full and present as anything they might have spoken. "We built something," he said. "We did," she said. "Together." "Together," she said. "Every bit of it." The Kansas winter held still around them, enormous and indifferent and full as it had always been of the possibility of springs.